has to make a part of a machine which he finishes in 1 day. The raw material, iron and brass in the necessary prepared form, costs 20 shillings. The consumption of coal by the steam engine, the wear and tear of this engine itself, of the turning lathe and of other tools with which our labourer works, represent for 1 day and 1 labourer a value of 1 shilling. The wages for 1 day are, according to our assumption, 3 shillings. This makes a total of 24 shillings for our piece of a machine. But the capitalist calculates that, on average, he will receive for it a price of 27 shillings from his customers, or 3 shillings over and above his outlay. Whence do they 3 shillings pocketed by the capitalist come? According to the assertion of classical political economy, commodities are, in the long run, sold at their values, that is, they are sold at prices which correspond to the necessary quantities of labour contained in them. The average price of our part of a machine, 27 shillings, would therefore equal its value, i.e. equal the amount of labour embodied in it. But, of these 27 shillings, 21 shillings were values already existing before the machinist began to work. 20 shillings were contained in the raw material, 1 shilling in the fuel consumed during the work, and in the machines and tools used in the process, and reduced in their efficiency to the value of this amount. There remain 6 shillings which have been added to the value of the raw material. But, according to the supposition of our economists themselves, these 6 shillings can arise only from the labour added to the raw material by the labourer. His 12 hours' labour created, according to this, a new value of 6 shillings. Therefore, the value of his 12 hours' labour would be equivalent to 6 shillings. So we have at last discovered what the value of labour is. "Hold on there," cries our machinist, 6 shillings, but I have received only 3 shillings. My capitalist swears high and day that the value of my 12 hours' labour is no more than 3 shillings, and if I were to demand 6, he'd laugh at me. What kind of story is that? If before this we got with our value of labour into a vicious circle, we now surely have driven straight into an insoluble contradiction. We searched for the value of labour, and we found more than we can use. For the labourer, the value of the 12 hours' labour is 3 shillings. For the capitalist, it is 6 shillings, of which he pays the working man 3 shillings as wages, and pockets the remaining 3 shillings himself. According to this, labour has not 1 but 2 values, and moreover 2 very different values. As soon as we reduce the values, now expressed in money, to labour time, the contradiction becomes even more absurd. By the 12 hours' labour, a new value of 6 shillings is created. Therefore, in 6 hours, the new value created equals 3 shillings, the amount which the labourer receives for 12 hours' labour. For 12 hours' labour, the working man receives as an equivalent the product of 6 hours' labour. We are thus forced to one of 2 conclusions. Either labour has 2 values, one of which is twice as large as the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases we get pure absurdities. Turn and twist as we may, we will not get out of this contradiction as long as we speak of the buying and selling of labour and of the value of labour. And just so it happened to the political economists. The last offshoot of classical political economy, the Ricardian school, was largely wrecked on the insolubility of this contradiction. Classical political economy had run itself into a blind alley. The man who discovered the way out of this blind alley was Karl Marx. What the economists had considered as the cost of production of labour was really the cost of production not of labour but of the living labourer himself, and what the labourer sold to the capitalist was not his labour. So soon as his labour really begins, says Marx, it ceases to belong to him, and therefore can no longer be sold by him. At the most, he could sell his future labour, i.e. assume the obligation of executing a certain piece of work in a certain time. But in this way he does not sell labour, which would first have to be performed, but for a stipulated payment he places his labour power at the disposal of the capitalist for a certain time, in case of time wages, or for the performance of a certain task, in case of peace wages. He hires out or sells his labour power, but this labour power has grown up with his person and is inseparable from it. Its cost of production, therefore, coincides with his own cost of production. What the economist called the cost of production of labour is really the cost of production of the labourer, and therewith of his labour power. And thus we can also go back from the cost of production of labour power to the value of labour power, and determine the quantity of social labour that is required for the production of a labour power of a given quantity, as Marx has done in the chapter on the buying and selling of labour power, Capital Volume 1. Now, what takes place after the worker has sold his labour power, i.e. after he has placed his labour power at the disposal of the capitalist for stipulated wages, whether time wages or piece wages? The capitalist takes the labourer into his workshop or factory, where all the articles required for the work can be found, raw materials, auxiliary materials, coal, dyestuffs, etc., tools and machines. Here the worker begins to work. His daily wages are, as above, 3 shillings, and it makes no difference whether he earns them as day wages or piece wages. We again assume that in 12 hours the worker adds by his labour a new value of 6 shillings to the value of the raw materials consumed, which new value the capitalist realises by the sale of the finished piece of work. Out of this new value he pays the worker his 3 shillings, and the remaining 3 shillings he keeps for himself. If now the labourer creates in 12 hours a value of 6 shillings, in 6 hours he creates a value of 3 shillings. Consequently, after working 6 hours for the capitalist, the labourer has returned to him the equivalent of the 3 shillings received as wages. After 6 hours' work, both are quits, neither one owing a penny to the other. "Hold on there," now cries out the capitalist. "I have hired the labourer for a whole day, for 12 hours, but 6 hours are only half a day, so work along lively there until the other 6 hours are at an end, only then will we be even." And in fact the labourer has to submit to the conditions of the contract upon which he entered of "his own free will," and according to which he bound himself to work 12 whole hours for a product of labour which cost only 6 hours' labour. Similarly with piece wages. Let us suppose that in 12 hours our worker makes 12 commodities. Each of these costs a shilling in raw materials and wear and tear, and is sold for 2.5 shillings. On our former assumption, the capitalist gives the labourer a quarter of a shilling for each piece, which makes a total of 3 shillings for 12 pieces. To earn this, the worker requires 12 hours. The capitalist receives 30 shillings for the 12 pieces. Deducting 24 shillings for raw materials and wear and tear, there remains 6 shillings, of which he pays 3 shillings in wages and pockets the remaining 3, just as before. Here also the worker labours 6 hours for himself, i.e. to replace his wages, half an hour in each of the 12 hours, and 6 hours for the capitalist. The rock upon which the best economists were stranded, as long as they started out from the value of labour, vanishes as soon as we make our starting point the value of labour power. Labour power is, in our present-day capitalist society, a commodity like every other commodity, but yet a very peculiar commodity. It has, namely, the peculiarity of being a value-creating force, the source of value, and, moreover, when properly treated, the source of more value than it possesses itself. In the present state of production, human labour power not only produces in a day a greater value than it itself possesses and costs, but with each new scientific discovery, with each new technical invention, there also rises the surplus of its daily production over its daily cost, while as a consequence there diminishes that part of the working day in which the labourer produces the equivalent of his day's wages, and, on the other hand, lengthens that part of the working day in which he must present labour gratis to the capitalist. And this is the economic constitution of our entire modern society. The working class alone produces all values, for value is only another expression for labour, that expression, namely, by which is designated, in our capitalist society of today, the amount of socially necessary labour embodied in a particular commodity. But these values produced by the workers do not belong to the workers. They belong to the owners of the raw materials, machines, tools, and money, which enable them to buy the labour power of the working class. Hence the working class get